Greenwich, Connecticut, December 24th, 2025. A woman is losing her future. The winter air stings, but there are no torches, only the rhythmic clink of silver against china and the quiet murder of a dream. My name is Sharon Roberts, and I am watching my father trade my life for my brother's legacy. The pine scent in this room is a lie, a mask for the rot beneath the floorboards. How do you survive a family that treats you like a debt to be settled? My grandmother's ghost is here watching the theft spill across the table. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The snow fell hard against the cedar siding of the house my father bought 40 years ago. It was a heavy, wet snow that clung to the pine branches and turned the driveway into a long, white tongue. I pulled the Volvo into the garage and sat for a moment. The engine ticked as it cooled. It was Christmas Eve in Connecticut, and the air was the kind of cold that made your teeth ache if you breathed it in too fast. I am 28 years old, and for 28 years this house has been the center of the world. I walked inside. The house smelled of roasting beef and wood smoke, and the sharp medicinal scent of the pine tree in the parlor. My mother was in the kitchen. She was moving with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a woman who had hosted 30 Christmases without ever burning a roll. She didn't look up when I walked in. She was basting the roast, her movements steady and rhythmic. I went to the sideboard and poured a gin and tonic. The ice was clear and hard. I liked the way the gin looked in the glass, transparent and cold. I took a long drink and felt it go down a sharp line of heat against the winter. My father was in his chair in the den. He was reading the paper, though the news was all on his phone now. He liked the weight of the paper. He liked things he could hold. We are Roberts, and Roberts value the things that stay put. I started setting the table. This was my job. It had always been my job. I went to the velvet-lined chest in the dining room and began taking out the silver. It was heavy, ornate silver that my grandmother had brought over from England. Each piece had a weight that felt like an anchor. I polished the tines of the forks with a linen cloth until they shone like mirrors. My grandmother had left me more than just the silver. She had left me the fund. $250,000 held in a trust my father managed, earmarked specifically for my wedding. She had been a woman who believed in the ceremony of things. She believed a woman should enter her new life with a foundation that no one could take away. I thought about that money as I laid the knives. I thought about David. David was quiet and steady. He worked in the city, and he didn't care for the noise of my family. We had picked a venue by the lake for June. It was a stone house with high ceilings and a view of the water that looked like a painting. It was expensive, but it was what the money was for. It was my grandmother's last wish, and it was my ticket to a life that didn't smell like wood smoke and old expectations. Kyle arrived at 6. He didn't knock. He never knocked. He burst through the door with his coat open, bringing the cold with him. He was 32 years older than me, and he carried himself with the frantic energy of a man who was always about to win a race that hadn't started yet. He slapped my father on the shoulder and kissed my mother on the cheek. They looked at him as if he were the sun. He had a new idea every month. Last month it was a logistics firm. This month it was a tech platform for disrupting the artisanal market. He talked fast and ate fast. I watched him take a handful of nuts from the silver bowl on the coffee table. He dropped a few on the rug and didn't pick them up. My father didn't mind. My father looked at Kyle and saw a legacy. He looked at me and saw a reliable piece of furniture. I finished the table. The glasses were straight. The silver was heavy. The room looked like a stage set for a play about people who have everything figured out. We sat down to dinner at 7. The roast was rare and perfect. My father carved it with a long, thin blade that he sharpened himself. He didn't speak while he worked. He focused on the grain of the meat. We ate in silence for a while, the only sound the clink of the heavy silver against the china. The community we lived in was small, and the values were clear. You worked hard, you kept your lawn clean, and you looked after your own. That was the American way, my father said. But in this house, looking after your own usually meant looking after Kyle. I took a bite of the beef. It was cold in the middle. I looked at the tree. The lights were white and steady. It was all very beautiful and very hollow. David couldn't make it until tomorrow, my mother asked. She didn't look up from her plate. He's finishing a project, I said. He'll be here for breakfast. He works too much for a man in his position, my father said. A man should be able to set his own hours. He's building something, Dad, I said. Like you did. My father grunted. He didn't think David was building anything. He thought David was a clerk. I didn't tell him that David was more than that. I didn't tell him because in this family information was a currency, and I liked to keep my accounts private. I felt the weight of the ring on my finger. It was a simple band. David had wanted to get something larger, but I told him no. I wanted something that didn't feel like a burden. I wanted something that was ours. I called the lake house yesterday, I said. I tried to keep my voice casual. I kept my eyes on my plate. They have the date for the 3rd of June. I need to send the deposit by the end of the week. The room went quiet. It wasn't the quiet of a pause. It was the quiet of a vacuum. My mother stopped chewing. My father laid his knife down across the top of his plate. The silver clicked against the porcelain. Kyle reached for the wine decanter and poured himself a full glass. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wine. The silence stretched until I could hear the snow ticking against the window again. It was a cold, sharp sound. I looked at my mother. She was looking at the candles in the center of the table. She looked as if she were trying to read the future in the flames. The lake house is very grand, Sharon, my mother said softly. It's what grandmother wanted, I said. She loved that spot. She used to take me there when I was little. She said it was the most honest place in the state. Grandmother was a romantic, my father said. His voice was deep and flat. He didn't look at me. He looked at Kyle. Romantics don't understand the way the world is turning now. The world is a hard place, Sharon. It's a place where you have to be fast or you get stepped on. I don't see what that has to do with the deposit, I said. My heart began to beat a little faster. I could feel the pulse in my neck. I took a sip of the gin. It was mostly melted ice now. It tasted like nothing. It has everything to do with it, my father said. He finally looked at me. His eyes were the color of the Atlantic in winter. We've been talking, your mother and Kyle. You've been talking about my wedding fund with Kyle, I asked. I felt a coldness spreading from my stomach to my limbs. It was a different kind of cold than the snow outside. It was a heavy, dead cold. We've been talking about the family, Kyle said. He leaned forward. His face was flushed with the wine. The Roberts name. We have an opportunity here, Sharon. A real one. Something that could change the trajectory of everything we've built. But it needs capital. Real capital. Not the pennies I've been scraping together. Capital, I repeated. The word felt heavy and sour in my mouth. The startup, my father said. It's a legacy project. It's about building something that lasts. A wedding is a party. It's over in a day. A business is a future. I looked at the silver. I looked at the forks I had polished and the knives I had aligned. I looked at the family I had served for 28 years by being the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who didn't ask for anything because I knew it was already mine. I thought about the $250,000. I thought about the freedom it represented. And then I looked at my father's face, and I realized that the unlogic of the situation was actually very logical. He wasn't breaking a trust. In his mind, he was finally investing it where it belonged. To him, I wasn't an investment. I was a liability that was about to be married off. You're taking my money, I said. It wasn't a question. We're reallocating it, my mother said. She reached out as if to touch my hand, but she stopped halfway. She adjusted her napkin instead. It's for the best, dear. You'll see. You and David. You don't need a spectacle. A courthouse wedding is very chic these days, very personal. You aren't really the type for a big party anyway, are you? I didn't answer. I just sat there. I felt the weight of the house pressing down on me. I felt the resilience of the wood and the stone and the years of being the daughter who didn't make a scene. I looked at Kyle. He was smiling. It was a small, triumphant smile. He thought he had won. He thought the legacy was his. I looked at the silver one last time. It looked very bright under the candlelight. It looked like something that belonged to a different world. The wine was a heavy Cabernet, the color of a bruised heart in the candlelight. I watched the way it coated the sides of my glass. My father stood up. He did not use the table for support. He stood straight the way a man stands when he believes he is doing something difficult but necessary. He cleared his throat and the sound was like gravel shifting in a pan. Kyle looked up, his eyes bright with a kind of predatory hunger. My mother kept her head down, her hands folded neatly over her napkin. She looked like she was praying, but she was only waiting. The room was too warm. The fire in the hearth was crackling, throwing orange light across the silver I had spent the afternoon polishing. It was a good room for a betrayal. It was solid and old and smelled of wealth that had been earned by men who didn't take no for an answer. "I've spent 40 years building this family," my father said. His voice was steady. It was his boardroom voice. "And a family is like a business. It requires strategy. It requires the courage to move resources where they will do the most good. We have a situation now where the future of the Roberts name is at stake. Kyle has shown me the projections for his new venture. It's a logistics platform that will streamline the entire East Coast supply chain. It's ambitious. It's what this country was built on: innovation and risk." He paused and looked at me. His eyes didn't soften. "The trust your grandmother left was meant to ensure your future, Sharon. But we've realized that your future is tied to the family's strength. If Kyle's business succeeds, we all succeed. Therefore, I've made the executive decision to move the $250,000 into Kyle's startup. It's an investment in our legacy." I felt the air leave my lungs. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I looked at the roast beef on my plate. It was gray now. "The money was for my wedding," I said. My voice sounded small and far away, like it belonged to someone else. "It was the only thing she left specifically for me." "A wedding is a party, Sharon," my father said. He sat back down. He picked up his fork and began to eat as if he had just commented on the weather. "A wedding is a vanity project. It's a day of expensive flowers and music that people forget by the next morning. You're asking us to burn $250,000 on a spectacle. Kyle's business is a legacy. It's something that will provide for this family for generations. You have to be resilient. You have to understand that personal desires come second to the health of the community. That's what it means to be a Roberts." "A vanity project," I repeated. The words tasted like copper. I looked at Kyle. He was nodding, his mouth full of potato. He looked smug. He looked like he had already spent the money in his head. "Think of it this way," Kyle said, swallowing. "When I'm running a Fortune 500 company, you'll be glad I had the seed money. You're always talking about freedom, Sharon. Real freedom comes from capital. I'm doing you a favor, really. I'm making sure the family stays relevant." "And what about my wedding?" I asked. I looked at my mother. She finally looked up. Her eyes were sympathetic, but it was the kind of sympathy you give to a wounded animal right before you put it down. "We've thought about that, dear," she said. Her voice was thin and sweet like cheap syrup. "David is such a sensible boy. He isn't the type for a grand ballroom and a 5-course meal. We think a courthouse wedding would be much more your speed. It's intimate, it's honest. You could have a lovely lunch afterward at that little bistro you like. Maybe even a backyard barbecue when the weather turns. It's much more grounded in the values we raised you with. You don't need the lace and the champagne to be married." "You told the lake house that I wasn't coming, didn't you?" I asked. My father didn't look up from his meat. "I called them this morning. I told them the deposit wouldn't be arriving. There's no sense in holding a date we aren't going to use. It's about efficiency, Sharon. You aren't worth the party. That's not a slight, it's just a fact. You aren't the type of person who needs that kind of attention. You're a worker. You're resilient. You'll get over this and you'll realize that we did the right thing for the name." The phrase "you aren't worth the party" hung in the air like a bad smell. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. In this house, worth was measured in what you could produce or what you could inherit. I was a teacher. I produced citizens, not dividends. I inherited expectations, not power. I looked around the room. These were my people. This was my community. They talked about American values, about hard work and freedom, but what they meant was their own comfort. They wanted me to be resilient so they didn't have to feel guilty about stealing from me. They wanted me to be quiet so they could enjoy the roast. David will be disappointed, I said. I was trying to keep my hands from shaking. I put them under the table and gripped my knees. The fabric of my dress was rough. David will understand, my father said. If he doesn't, then he isn't the man for you. A man needs to understand the importance of a legacy. He's a good lad, but he's modest. He doesn't have the fire Kyle has. He doesn't need a $250,000 party any more than you do. You'll have your courthouse wedding, you'll move into a nice little rental, and in 10 years, you'll thank me when Kyle is taking care of us all. You're taking my freedom, I said. You're taking my choice. We're making the right choice for you, my mother said. It's a burden really having to plan something that big. Now you're free from the stress. You should be happy. You can focus on your work. You can be the support Kyle needs. That's your role, Sharon. It always has been. I looked at the silver again. I thought about my grandmother. She had been a tall woman with a hard face and a soft heart. She had saved that money dollar by dollar over decades. She had survived the Depression and a husband who drank and a world that didn't want women to own anything. She had left it to me because she knew I was the only one who understood what it meant to hold on to something. And now my father had signed it away with a phone call because his son wanted to play at being a CEO. Is that all? I asked. That's all, my father said. Pass the salt, Kyle. I sat there while they talked about logistics and server costs and market share. They didn't mention the wedding again. It was a dead thing. They had buried it under the table. I felt a strange cold clarity settling over me. It was the kind of clarity a soldier gets when the shelling stops and he realizes he's the only one left in the trench. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry. Hemingway wrote about the world breaking everyone, and afterwards some being strong at the broken places. I felt myself hardening. The resilience they wanted from me was going to be the very thing that destroyed them. They thought they knew who I was. They thought I was the girl who would take the courthouse wedding and the backyard barbecue and say thank you for the crumbs. They didn't know about David. They didn't know about Arthur. They didn't know that for the last 3 years I had been keeping a secret of my own. I had wanted to tell them tonight. I had wanted to share the news that David's family was coming for dessert and that our wedding was going to be the social event of the decade, not because of my money, but because of who David was. But now that news was a weapon, and I was going to wait for the right moment to use it. I took a sip of the water. It was clear and cold. I looked at my father and I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a hunter who sees the trap is about to spring. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock. It was a precise sound, sharp and cutting through the drone of Kyle's voice as he explained the scalability of his cloud-based infrastructure. My father looked at his watch. He liked punctuality, but he didn't like interruptions when he was the one speaking. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but my mind was clear. I walked to the front door, leaving the warmth of the dining room for the chill of the foyer. I opened the door and the wind pushed a swirl of snow inside. Arthur stood there. He was a tall man, silver-haired and straight-backed, wearing a charcoal wool coat that looked soft enough to be liquid. He didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a man who had seen everything and found most of it wanting. He didn't carry a gift. He didn't need to. He stepped inside and shook the snow from his shoulders. He looked at me and his eyes were kind, but they were also very old. He knew. I could see it in the way he held my gaze. He had arrived early, and he had been standing on the porch. The walls of the Roberts house were thick, but the windows were old, and the voices inside had been loud with the arrogance of men who think they are alone. "Sharon," he said. His voice was like a low cello note. "It is a cold night." "It is Arthur. Come in. My parents are in the dining room." I led him into the room where the remains of the roast sat like a carcass on the table. My father didn't stand up immediately. He looked Arthur up and down, taking in the lack of a tie, the simple sweater, and the lack of a visible brand on the coat. My father made a snap judgment, the kind he made about simple people who worked for a living. He stayed in his chair. Kyle didn't even stop eating. He just waved a fork in Arthur's general direction. My mother offered a tight, polite smile, the kind she reserved for the help or the neighbors she didn't like. "You must be David's father," my father said. He didn't offer his hand. "We were just finishing. I'm George. This is my wife Martha and our son Kyle. Sharon said you were a distinguished gentleman. I suppose that's one way to put it." Arthur didn't take offense. He stood at the head of the table, his hands resting lightly on the back of an empty chair. He looked at the silver. He looked at the wine. Then he looked at my father. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. The air in the room seemed to thin out. "I've been standing on your porch for 10 minutes, Arthur said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. It was the voice of a man who never had to raise it. "The wood is cedar, but the seals are poor. I heard a great deal. I heard about vanity projects and legacies. I heard about the reallocation of a dead woman's wishes. It was very illuminating. In my world, George, a man's word is his only real currency. A man who steals from his daughter to fund a son's fantasies is a man who is technically bankrupt regardless of what is in his savings account." My father's face turned a deep mottled purple. He pushed his chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the floor. "Now look here. This is a private family matter. You've got a lot of nerve coming into my house and it stopped being private when you invited my son into your family," Arthur interrupted. He didn't move. He stood like a statue. "And it stopped being your house the moment you decided your daughter wasn't worth the party. I find I have a very low tolerance for people who mistake cruelty for pragmatism." "You mentioned resilience earlier, George. You said Sharon was resilient." "You're right. She has the kind of resilience that comes from surviving people like you. But she won't have to be resilient in this house anymore." "Who do you think you are?" Kyle sneered. He dropped his fork. "You're some guy David met at a community college or something. You're in over your head, old man. This is a business family. We make moves." Arthur turned his gaze to Kyle. It was like watching a hawk look at a mouse. "I am Arthur Huntington," he said. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Even Kyle stopped smirking. The Huntington name was on the side of hospitals, on the masthead of international foundations, and at the top of the Forbes list for 3 decades. My father's jaw literally dropped. He looked at the simple man in the charcoal coat, and his eyes began to dart around the room looking for a way to undo the last 10 minutes. He tried to stand, but his knees seemed to fail him. He sank back down. "Huntington," my mother whispered. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying kind of greed. "Sharon, why didn't you tell us?" "Because it shouldn't have mattered," I said. I felt a cold heat in my chest. "If I had told you he was a billionaire, you would have been wonderful to me. You would have given me the wedding and the silver and your blessing. But I wanted to see who you were when you thought I had nothing. And now I know." Arthur looked at me and nodded. Then he looked back at my father. "I have 2 things to say to you, George. The first is about Sharon. She is leaving tonight. David is waiting at the end of the drive. I've purchased a property in the hills, a manor if you want to use the vulgar term. It's been sitting empty. I've decided it's a wedding gift. She's moving in tonight. Her things can be sent later or they can be burned. It doesn't matter. She won't need anything from this house ever again." My father was shaking now. He reached for his wine glass, but his hand was trembling too much to pick it up. "Arthur, Mr. Huntington, I had no idea. There's been a misunderstanding. The money, it was just a temporary loan for Kyle. We were going to pay it back. We value Sharon. She's the heart of this family." "Don't lie, George. It's beneath the dignity of the suit you're wearing," Arthur said. His voice became even colder. "That brings me to the second thing. You work for Mid-Atlantic Logistics, don't you, Senior VP of Operations?" My father nodded slowly. A look of pure terror crossed his face. He knew what was coming. He knew the way the world worked, and he knew that Arthur Huntington didn't make small talk. I spent the last 3 months in negotiations, Arthur said. He pulled a small leather-bound notebook from his pocket and laid it on the table. It looked like a ledger. I closed the acquisition this morning. Vanguard Holdings now owns 98% of Mid-Atlantic. I bought it because I liked the infrastructure, but I've been looking at the leadership. I've been looking for the dead wood. I've been looking for the men who have become comfortable and arrogant. The men who think they can mistreat their subordinates and their families because they think they are untouchable. Arthur leaned in his face inches from my father's. I am the chairman of the board now, George. Your boss's boss's boss. And tomorrow morning when the office is open, I am beginning a restructuring process. I am looking for staff to lay off. Specifically, I am looking for anyone whose character does not align with the values of Vanguard. I think you can guess whose name is at the top of that list. You wanted to talk about a legacy for Kyle. You just spent your legacy on a dinner Sharon will never forget. The room was silent. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. I could hear my mother's ragged breathing. My father looked like a man who had been hollowed out. He looked at Kyle, and for the first time in his life he didn't see a future. He saw the reason he was about to lose everything. Kyle looked at the floor. The Series A funding was gone. The logistics platform was a ghost. The power had shifted so fast and so violently that the air still felt charged with the energy of it. Sharon, Arthur said, turning to me, the car is warm. We should go. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at Kyle. I looked at my father one last time. He looked small. He looked like a man who had lived his whole life believing that money was a shield, only to find out it was a target. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anger. I felt a clean, sharp sense of completion. I walked to the sideboard, picked up my gin and tonic, and finished it in one long, cold swallow. I set the glass down on the polished wood. Happy Christmas, Dad, I said. I followed Arthur out of the room. We walked through the foyer and out into the snow. The cold felt wonderful. It felt like a baptism. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the life I had lived for 28 years. I walked toward the lights of the car waiting at the gate. The snow was falling hard, but I could see exactly where I was going. The dining room was a tomb, and we were the things left inside it. My father did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the white tablecloth, and for the first time in my life I saw his age. It was not in his hair or his skin, but in the way his shoulders had surrendered to the air. He looked like a man who had been holding a heavy weight for 40 years and had finally dropped it on his own feet. The color was gone from his face, replaced by a gray, ash-like pallor that made him look like a statue in a park. Arthur did not wait for a response. He had said what he came to say, and in his world words were like bullets. Once fired, you did not stay to watch the impact. He turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy and certain on the hardwood. He did not look back. He did not need to. He had dismantled my father's life with the same clinical precision one might use to prune a dead branch from a tree. I stood there for a long moment, watching the way the candlelight flickered in the draft Arthur had left behind. My mother was the first to break the silence. She did not cry. She was a woman who had been trained to manage social disasters, and she reached for the only tool she had left. She reached for the hospitality that was her armor. She stood up and moved toward the sideboard, her hands trembling as she reached for a heavy crystal decanter. "Arthur," she called out, though he was already in the foyer. "Wait, we have the good scotch, the 20-year. George, tell him. We should sit. We should talk about the transition. Surely there's a place for experience in the new company. We're family after all. Everything can be negotiated." Her voice was high and brittle, the sound of glass breaking under a boot. She didn't look at me. She looked at the doorway, hoping that a bottle of brown liquid could undo the destruction of a lifetime. She was a woman who believed that a clean house and a full glass could solve any crisis of the soul. My father didn't answer her. He just stared at the spot where Arthur had been standing. He was an employee now. He was a line item on a spreadsheet owned by the man he had just called a simple in-law. The irony was a cold thing, and it sat on the table between us like a third guest. I did not stay to watch her pour the scotch. I turned and walked toward the stairs. My mother called my name, once her voice sharp with a sudden, desperate command, but I did not stop. I had spent 28 years stopping when she called. Tonight the thread had snapped. The hallway was lined with photos of our lives. There was Kyle at graduation. There was my father receiving an award from the Chamber of Commerce. There was the family at the Cape, all of us dressed in white, smiling into a sun that had set years ago. I realized looking at them that I was a background character in every frame. I was the one who filled the space so the others looked complete. I went into my bedroom and shut the door. The room was cold. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need it. I knew where everything was. I pulled a small leather suitcase from the back of the closet. It was the one I used for weekend trips to the city to see David. I began to pack. I did not take much. I took my journals. I took the sweater David had given me for my birthday. I took the small silver clock that had belonged to my grandmother, the only thing of hers they hadn't managed to turn into a legacy. I moved with a steady, rhythmic pace. Hemingway wrote about the importance of doing things well and truly. I folded my clothes with care. I zipped the bag. It was light. It was the weight of a life that was finally mine. The dress was hanging on the back of the door. It was a navy silk sheath that my mother had bought for me 2 weeks ago. She had told me it was sensible for a woman of my standing. It was expensive and heavy and felt like a uniform. I looked at it for a long time. It was the last thing she had given me, a bribe disguised as a gift, a way to ensure I looked the part of the daughter she wanted me to be. I took it off the hanger. I felt the cool slide of the silk against my skin. I did not put it in the bag. I laid it out on the center of the bed, smoothing the wrinkles until it looked like a person lying there. I left it behind. It was a shell I had outgrown. I walked out of the room and did not look back. As I reached the top of the stairs, Kyle was waiting for me. He looked smaller than he had at dinner. The bravado had leaked out of him, leaving behind a frantic, sweating man who realized the ground had moved beneath him. "Sharon," he said. He reached out as if to grab my arm, but he stopped when he saw my face. "You have to talk to him. You have to talk to Arthur. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him it was a joke. The money, you can have it. We'll figure something else out. But you can't let him do this to Dad. You can't let him take the company. It's our future. It's my future." He was pleading now, his voice cracking. He looked like the boy who used to break my toys and then cry so I would get in trouble for it. He was a man who had never been told no, and now the world was saying it in a voice he couldn't ignore. "The money was never the point, Kyle," I said. My voice was as cold as the wind outside. "The point was that you took it. You took it because you thought I didn't matter. You took it because Dad told you that you were the only one who did. And now you're finding out that the world doesn't care about your startup. The world cares about character. And yours is worth exactly what you paid for it." "You're destroying us," he hissed. "For what? A party? A wedding?" "No," I said, stepping past him. "For the freedom to never have to look at you again." I walked down the stairs. My mother was sitting at the dining table now. She had poured 2 glasses of scotch. One was for my father, but he hadn't touched it. He was still staring at the wall. She looked up as I reached the bottom step. Her eyes were hard. The sympathy was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp resentment. I was no longer her daughter. I was the person who had brought a wolf into their home. "If you walk out that door, Sharon, don't think you can come back when things get hard," she said. "We are a family that values loyalty. You've shown none." "I've shown you 28 years of loyalty," I said. "You just didn't think it had a price. It turns out the price was my grandmother's trust. You spent it, and now I'm gone." I picked up my suitcase and walked to the front door. The house felt different now. It felt like a stage after the play has ended. The pine smell was cloying. The silver was just metal. The perfection of the Roberts life was a thin coat of paint over dry rot. I opened the door and the cold air hit me like a physical hand. It was honest. It was clean. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I walked down the steps, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. The driveway was white and long. At the end of it, near the stone pillars of the gate, I saw the glowing red taillights of a car. It was idling, the exhaust rising in white plumes against the dark woods. I didn't run. I walked. I felt the weight of the suitcase in my hand and the cold on my face. I felt resilient. I felt like a woman who had finally learned how to breathe. David was waiting. The world was waiting. Behind me, the house was full of silver and scotch and people who had nothing left. Ahead of me, there was only the snow and the road. It was a good road. The car was warm, and it smelled of old leather and the heater's dry breath. David did not ask questions. He was a man who understood that some things are finished long before the words are spoken. He put the car in gear and the tires crunched through the fresh powder as we moved away from the stone gate. I looked in the side mirror. The lights of my father's house were small and yellow against the black of the trees. They looked like the eyes of a dying animal. Then we turned the corner, and the house was gone. There was only the road. The snow was falling in big, heavy flakes that disappeared when they hit the windshield. We drove for a long time without speaking. The silence was not the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room. It was the silence of the woods. It was the silence of things that are moving toward a conclusion. I felt the weight of the silver clock in my lap. It was small and cold. It was the only part of my grandmother I had left, and it felt right that it was traveling with me. I looked at David. He was watching the road. His hands were steady on the wheel. He was a good man, and he was a quiet man, and he was exactly what I needed. We passed through the outskirts of the town, past the darkened shops and the closed gas stations. The world was asleep, and it did not care about legacies or startups or the restructuring of logistics firms. It only cared about the cold and the snow. "Are you hungry?" David asked. His voice was low, and it didn't jar the air. "I am hungry," I said. The roast was cold. "There is a place up ahead. It stays open." "That would be good," I said. We pulled into the parking lot of a diner called the Blue Plate. It was a long, low building with a neon sign that hummed in the frost. The light was blue and white, and it made the snow look like salt. We went inside. The air was thick with the smell of frying onions and burnt coffee and floor wax. It was a bright, clean place. The windows were steamed over, cutting us off from the night. We sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats that groaned when we moved. A waitress came over. She was an older woman with tired eyes and a name tag that said Rose. She didn't look like my mother. She didn't look like anyone who had ever polished silver. She looked like someone who had worked a long shift and was looking forward to the end of it. She put 2 heavy ceramic mugs on the table and filled them with coffee. The coffee was black, and it sent up a thin plume of steam. It was the best thing I had seen all night. "You folks look like you've been through a drift," she said. "We have," I said. "Well, the heat is on. Take your time." She walked away, and I wrapped my hands around the mug. My hands were steady. I looked at them, and I was surprised. I thought they would be shaking. I thought the blood would be pounding in my ears. But there was only a great stillness. I was Sharon Roberts, and I was 28, and I was no longer a piece of furniture in a house in Connecticut. I looked at the ring on my finger. It was just a band of gold. It didn't represent $250,000. It didn't represent a Series A investment. It represented a promise made between 2 people in the dark. I realized then that the unlogic of my family was that they believed tradition was a cage you built for others, while resilience was the strength to stay inside it. They were wrong. Resilience was the strength to leave. It was the ability to look at a life that was comfortable and perfect, and realize it was a lie. My father had lost his job and his son's future in a single hour because he thought he was the only one who knew how to play the game. He had forgotten that when you treat people like things, eventually, the things stop working. He was a man who valued the name, but he had forgotten how to be the man who earned it. Arthur said the house is ready, David said. He was stirring sugar into his coffee. The spoon made a small rhythmic clicking against the side of the mug. He said you could go there tonight or we could stay at the hotel. It's a big house, Sharon. It's more than we ever talked about. The house is a gift, I said. But the house isn't the point. I know. He bought the company, David. He bought my father's life. David nodded. He does not like it when people are unkind. He has spent a long time being powerful, and he thinks power should have a purpose. He saw what they were doing to you. He heard them. I'm glad he heard them, I said. I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, and it was bitter. It was honest. I felt it go down a line of warmth that settled the coldness in my stomach. I thought about the mansion Arthur had mentioned. It would be grand, and it would be silent, and it would be ours. But it wouldn't be a Roberts house. There would be no velvet-lined chests of silver that I had to polish for a brother who didn't know my name. There would be no legacy that required the sacrifice of my freedom. I was free. I was free from the expectation of being the reliable one. I was free from the community that judged you by the venue of your wedding rather than the quality of your character. I thought about the courthouse wedding my mother had suggested as an insult. I realized now that I wanted it. I wanted something small and clean and fast. I wanted to be married in a room with white walls and a judge who didn't know our history. I wanted the backyard barbecue because the air would be fresh and there would be no ghosts at the table. My mother had tried to use my personal freedom as a weapon against me, but all she had done was hand me the keys. The diner was quiet. A truck driver sat at the counter hunched over a plate of eggs. The hum of the neon sign was a steady, comforting drone. I felt a profound sense of peace. It was the peace of the clean, well-lighted place that Hemingway wrote about, a place where the shadows are held at bay by the simple reality of things that are what they are. A cup is a cup, a road is a road, a man is a man. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 3 a.m. On this day, Christmas, I had lost a fortune and a family, and I had never felt wealthier. I had been culturally grounded in the American idea of the self-made life, but I had been living a life made by others. Now the grounding was real. It was beneath my boots. It was in the steady rhythm of my heart. I reached across the table and touched David's hand. His skin was warm and his grip was firm. We should go, I said. The snow is letting up. Where to? To the new house. I want to see the sun come up from a different window. We paid the bill. I left a $20 bill on the table for Rose. It was a good tip, and she had earned it by being there when the world was cold. We walked out of the diner. The air was sharp, and it smelled of the morning. The sky was turning a deep bruised purple in the east. The car started on the first try. We pulled out of the parking lot and onto the highway. The plows had been through and the road was a black ribbon through the white. I leaned my head against the window. The glass was cool. I watched the telephone poles go by one after another, like markers on a map of a country I was seeing for the first time. I was Sharon Roberts, and I was beginning. I was 28, and the weight of the silver was gone. I felt fine. I felt better than I had ever felt in the house of my father. The road stretched out ahead, long and straight and clear. It was a good road. The snow was falling on the road ahead. It was a good road. She felt fine.